Okay, working on a Nissan Titan Cummins that came in here because it won't run. It runs really weird, and there is oil dumping where the engine and transmission meet, which typically you tend to think is a rear main seal or an upper oil pan or an oil pan gasket or something crazy like that for oil to leak. But the amount of oil that is coming out of this was very, very significant. So began looking into it by pulling the top half of the motor apart, knowing that it had recently been worked on by Nissan in Greenfield and Nissan in Waukesha here under warranty work, and now the truck's out of warranty, so the owner is kind of stuck in the water here. So we pulled the motor apart, and a few things to note. Took the top half of the motor apart, and here's the engine valley. There's a hole at the back of the valley there that when you pour oil down that hole, it comes out of the bottom of the motor leaking just as it does. So when I did that before pulling the turbos, that was kind of a test to see, is this potentially coming from here or is this coming from somewhere else? That is the downpipe here, and something about the downpipe is that it is coated inside with oil. So there must be a leak in one of the turbos that is dumping oil down the downpipe, which the owner had to replace the DPF. And they were told the DPF is not under warranty. However, all the oil coming out of the downpipe is probably what ruined the DPF, because they're not meant to filter oil. They also missed a bolt on these are feeding off the manifolds from the left and right head. So this feeds the turbo. So I guess you could call it the up pipe. Missing a bolt off of these 3 bolts here, so there's only 2 holding the exhaust onto the turbo. My thought before pulling the turbos is that I want to inspect the gasket that meets between the engine valley block and the turbo, because I was thinking maybe that gasket was leaking, but there's a lot of oil leaking out of it. Here's the 2 pressure lines. Pressure lines look okay. The only thing I would note is if you look in here, this is really crudded up. So I don't know if there's other problems going on where there's dirty oil getting put to the turbos or something else, but that was not noticed on the inspection when they swapped the turbos. This one goes to the upper, smaller turbo. This one goes to the lower, big turbo. So let's go take a look at the turbos here. That might tell us a little bit more what's going on, but we're kind of unsure. So we have the larger turbo, and then we have the smaller turbo. The smaller turbo actually is just meant for spooling up, and you can't really see it very well with the camera, but I can stick my finger in here and it spins real nice and free. This bolts onto the larger turbo. This is the downpipe. That was the other option, is that this return line maybe was leaking, but we're not seeing any holes in it or oil around it that would be leaking down in the valley and causing oil to pour out like it was. Here's a model and serial number if we need that for reference. But yeah, here's a smaller turbo. Now, the larger turbo has a few things to note about it. It has a leak coming from the butterfly valve, which I don't even know how that's leaking, because I wasn't aware that oil got fed to this butterfly valve. This goes up the motor and gets connected to a little servo or an actuator that moves this around. The smaller turbo bolts on here. Exhaust from both heads comes into here, and then this goes to the EGR cooler. And if the EGR cooler doesn't command flow, there's a butterfly valve on the other end of the EGR cooler. If it doesn't command flow, all of the exhaust is going either here or down into the big turbo. So it's either going into the little turbo or the big turbo via this butterfly valve. So at low RPMs, this is probably shut, dumping all the exhaust gas into the little turbo. Once it meets as much boost or RPM as it can, something dictates this closing and dumping the rest of the air down into the big turbo. The other interesting thing to note is the exhaust gas that's feeding the little turbo actually comes out of the small turbo and ends up feeding the big turbo. So we know that there's nothing wrong with the small turbo because this is just dried soot. There's no wet, oily residue here. There's just soot coming out of this. So you know that the little turbo is not dumping oil down the big turbo. However, like I showed you on the downpipe, here is the other side of what bolts down to that downpipe, and it is just soaking wet, and there's oil all down in there. So I'm gonna guess that the seal inside of here went, and the pressurized oil that feeds into here is getting dumped down the exhaust, which is why the owner has had to replace his DPF because of the fact that the turbo killed the DPF. Here is the seal. This is the return oil. It's a nice squishy seal. Some of these get really hard and stiff, so they don't seal very well. It's kind of in the middle. It's not super soft, but it's also not super stiff. So I'm wondering if this could still potentially be leaking. It may or may not be. But this leaking could definitely be a reason why there's oil dumping down the valley. And the final thing to note about this larger turbo is when I go to spin it, let's turn this around a little bit here. When I go to spin it, it does not spin. And I have to actually exert quite a bit of force to get it to spin. Like normally you would spin these and they would continue spinning. This thing is really, really solid. So there is the model and serial number for reference. So this was the turbo that was replaced by Nissan of Greenfield. It took like 6 months or something ridiculous. He lost his truck for 6 months and it sat in the parking lot while they ordered a new turbo. And it turns out that this is a bad turbo. And then the smaller turbo was replaced by Nissan Waukesha, which is really unfortunate because to be able to get to the smaller turbo, you would have to take off a bunch of piping and you could have stuck your hand in here and realized, hey, there's something wrong here. This sucker should not be this stiff. So, could be a couple other things wrong with the truck. It's hard to say right now. It doesn't run, or it doesn't run well, and when it does run, it barely seems like it has any power. This could be a very good reason because the motor's getting choked out and it can't get rid of exhaust and breathe again. So there's a number of things going on. There's also a knocking noise, and I don't know if that's related to this too now. So this has just been an interesting issue for the owner to have to be dealing with this nonstop now for almost a year. And then once it went out of warranty, it's kind of lost. So